welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica and
Donna.
And we're on Turn the Page podcast at Syosset Library. How are you?
Fantastic. I'm really well, thank you. Really well. It's a nice grey skied day here in London.
That was actually our first question was, are you calling from London?
What's the weather like? Yeah.
Yes, it's kind of dreary here today. But welcome to New York in voice only, and congratulations on Those People. Today is the release date here, correct?
It is, yes, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really exciting. It's not out yet in the UK, so it's really cool to be out in the US first.
That's really nice. Well, congratulations. So Donna and I, we both read both Our House and Those People back to back just to get a start. Now, this is your so Our House was your lucky 13th book?
Our House was my 12th
Oh,
book.
It was, okay. Those People is lucky 13th.
But debut in the US, yes. And then Those People is my 13th book and my second book in the US. So I think you've definitely started with the best.
Thank you so much. So Donna and I we were chatting about Those People, which is
in your style of property noir, or as you call it, property porn. And
yes, property porn lit. It's often referred to in the UK, which I'm not that keen on that. I love suburban noir. I think that's a good description.
That sounds good. Yeah, I thought that it was, everyone knows of a bad neighbor situation, whether you faced it yourself or have heard of something in your neighborhood. And I could totally see referring to certain people on my block as those people.
But the funny thing was that we were talking about this book, and those people, I mean, Darren and Jody, was it? They're terrible neighbors.
That's right.
I don't think that that's in dispute. They're inconsiderate. They blast music. Like what kind of music do they blast?
Metal music. Metal.
They like heavy metal. They like sort of 80s heavy metal like Metallica and Guns N' Roses, but they also will enjoy a bit of thrash metal like Megadeth, which is unbearable even to those of us who love heavy metal.
Yes, I agree. I agree with you. Apologies to all of our Megadeth fans out there, but yes, I agree with you. So there,
that's the problem with music, though. I think it is a matter of taste, isn't it? And so,
it totally is.
In a neighborhood scenario, you need to remember that not everyone shares your music taste.
That's true. So Darren and Jody, bad neighbors, but Those People could also refer to
the other people in the neighborhood who were very sort of controlling of how their neighborhood was, and the brothers,
absolutely,
and families,
yeah.
They wanted someone who.
No, that's right, and that was very much my objective was. Initially it seems obvious who those people must be. They're the toxic new neighbors, the neighbors from hell. But I'm hoping that, quite quickly in the reading experience, you start to shift your perspective a bit and to sort of think, well, actually, these, even before any crimes are committed, you're dealing with very judgmental people. I mean, who are Ralph and Naomi, the kingpins, to impose their perfect way of life on other people? It's an ever-shifting thing, I think, and by the end of the book, I think that I'm hoping that everyone will have a different idea of who Those People refers to.
I think it was varied, and it was very interesting just the way that the stories sort of laid on top of each other. The foundation, if you will, going with the property aspect of it was, this neighborhood and neighbors who seemed to fit very well together. And then somebody coming and toppling that foundation. But as the story goes on, you kind of wonder how well they really fit together to begin with. You have the...
No, that's right, because
Yes.
it's kind of artificial, isn't it? And maybe neighborhood relationships are quite artificial. They're about cooperation and a few shared values. But as you say, as soon as there's a disruption and there's a threat, I think you see these fault lines emerge, both between the neighbors themselves and also, within households and in marriages and in family relationships. It doesn't take that much for cracks to start to appear. It's very tempting to use the sort of the building metaphors when talking about this plot, but you do see these sort of big cracks they start as a hairline crack in the plaster work, and then suddenly actually you've got a great big structural crack down relationships and down families. And I was really interested in exploring that because I see it all the time. I see, people sort of striving for perfection and this whole notion of living your best life. And it's not really sustainable. And so when these disruptors come into the picture, things escalate really, really quickly.
Well, it interested me because they kept going back to see if there was any type of stipulations in their contracts, or I think like in the community, to see if are they allowed to take down that wall, or is there anything against scaffolding. And it was almost like their perfect community failed them because there wasn't they didn't have the wherewithal to really enforce what they wanted.
No, that's right. And I think, every neighborhood is different, and it's perhaps the same with the different towns and states within the U.S. But here, all of that domestic neighborhood stuff is the responsibility of the council. So it's not really, the police don't really get involved. Here, the police would only be involved if someone actually threatened someone or someone felt unsafe in their home. There'd been an act of violence. Obviously, in the book, the police are involved when a death occurs. But in terms of parking squabbles, running a business from your premises, which Jodie and Darren do, playing music, generally being noisy and creating dirt and dust, they're all council matters. And so they take quite a long time to solve. The neighbours do have their meeting and they try and go through the official processes. But it's actually frustratingly hard to do and tends to almost favour the culprit. It's quite easy to carry on doing this stuff. Darren might be issued with various warnings or even fines, but he can still park 10 cars on his drive and knock down a wall. And once you've chopped down a tree or knocked down a historic wall, it's, you can't replant it. You can't sort of bring it back to life. So he's doing all of this stuff before anyone can stop him.
And it's interesting because here, depending on the community you live in, sometimes you have a homeowners association and they're on top of you right away. Like you can't do anything if you're in one of those communities without their approval. But it was and I do have some friends who live in that situation, but it was interesting reading this where, they're waiting so long. And I did, you do feel for the neighbors. Now, just with this book versus our house only had the perspective of two people, right, Donna? It was
That's right. Yes, right. Bram and Fee, the estranged couple.
Yeah. And right away with them, you could tell, it wasn't like they had an ideal situation, even though they were trying to make one. But with those people, they all felt, or they, were acting like they had this ideal neighborhood. But you had a lot more narrators in those people than you did in our house. How is that different, writing style? Because you don't even get Darren or Jodie's perspective until much later on.
Not really. No, you get a tiny little excerpt you get a couple of pages of excerpt from Darren's police interview, and then you get a little excerpt from Jodie as well. But there are four main narrators as opposed to two in our house. And as you point out, it's a similar community, but I think in our house, The crimes are within the marriage, and the actual relationships on the street are very solid and very good. And Fee has a very solid group of female friends. But in those people, you feel like everyone's quite fragile, and I really wanted to bring a sense of that. But I think it's probably harder to have multiple narrators. It's harder to make it work for the reader, but it's kind of more fun for a writing experience, if you see what I mean. So I had to avoid being too self-indulgent. It was really good for me to be able to move from one perspective to another, and to have a week when I was Ralph, and then to have another week when I was Sissy. And then, if I got a bit bored, I could be Tess for a bit. And then I had the police interviews, which had a very different tone, because the way people speak to the police is very different from the way I portrayed them in their chapters. So it was really good fun to do, but it is actually quite hard to keep people's interest. And I think the way people consume books now, readers can lose interest quite quickly. So I had to work quite hard, and my editors had to work quite hard in stopping me from dwelling too long on character, and to sort of keep things moving, because I am writing slow burn suspense. This is not a thriller minute. There's not a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. I am asking people to stay with me for quite a long time before there is a death or a crime. So it did present new challenges for me, but with every book I have tried a different narrative technique. I just like to do something new for my to improve and to experiment, but it's so hard to know until readers' reviews come in. It's so hard to know which ones actually work best. And they might work best in another format, of course. Some of my books might work better in audio actually than on the printed page. So it's hard to know, but for me, it's exciting to challenge myself.
I was wondering, what is your process? Is it always the same, or do you write depending on how the book is structured? Do you write each section separately, or do you and then weave it together, or how do you approach? I try
to do it as chronologically as I can, or in the order it's going to be read. But when I move on to second, third, fourth draft, I might do revisions in strands. So part of the process for this one at one point was that I read all of Ralph's chapters in one go, and then I read all of Sissy's chapters in one go, and so on. So I could avoid repetition within their own character strands. But always I'm conscious of, if it needs to work the way the reader reads it. And so I try and do my revisions. I try and keep things chronological, and I try and read as much of the book as I can in one go when I'm revising, because otherwise you could have a month writing, to say the last part of the book, and you've completely forgotten about what you've established early on. So it's quite hard with so many words, because you of course can't read a whole draft in one day. But I try not to spend too much time away from any one section, if I can.
Do you write in longhand, or you type it as you go?
I type it, yeah. And there's typically about 5 drafts.
5 drafts.
So I will, so my first draft will go to my editors, and I have really brilliant collaborative editors in London and in New York, and they will usually come back with an extensive structural edit after my first draft. So there'll be lots and lots of changes, lots of suggestions, lots of great ideas. And so my second draft is a big deal. That will take quite a long time. And then ideally after that point, it's more a case of refining and, ironing out the things that aren't quite working, and fleshing out the characters. And then the very final draft will be polishing and maybe just scattering in a few little clues, or, red herrings. So there really is a process. It's a much longer, more in-depth process than I think people people think. I think when people imagine someone writing a novel, there's just one draft. But, there'll be a minimum of 5 for me.
We were reading about the story that inspired you to write Our House, about a family or a couple whose house was sold without their knowledge.
That's right. Yes. I mean, lots of people thought that I'd made up the crime in our house and that property fraud, was a figment of my imagination, but it's absolutely a huge crime problem. And so, yes, Our House was inspired directly by a report I read in the Daily Mail Online, about a woman who owned a house in London, but she didn't live there, and she didn't have a mortgage on it either, which is often a key factor. A property that doesn't have a mortgage is much more attractive to a criminal. And she, what happened in that case was that the house, the one tenant left the property, and new tenants took the lease and moved in, and they were a criminal gang. And one of the gang changed her name legally. We would say by deed poll. She legally changed her name to the same name as the owner of the property, and then they promptly sold it.
Wow.
And I honestly, you could go and do that tomorrow. Although the legal profession is much more clued up about it now. In the recent years, there's been a lot of press and a lot of new guidelines for the legal profession here. You could still do it, and I think you could still do what Bram does to Fee in Our House, because he has the benefit of having access to all of her private documents and all of the documents to do with the house. And so, really one of the messages of that book is, if you're splitting up with someone, keep your passport separate and keep your private documents separate, because if someone else has access to your private documents and identifications, then anything could happen.
I know here, there's like people will try to take out mortgages under your name, and it's crazy.
Yeah.
But with those people, did you have a specific inspiration? Or just bad neighbors make bad moods?
Well, I have had that year. I honestly do. I could have gone to any street corner in any town, and I could have had inspiration for those people. The number of stories I've been told, true stories I've been told over the last 10, 20 years about bad neighbors, ranging from, I know a couple who moved into a dream Georgian townhouse, and within 24 hours became aware that next door there was an illegal brothel.
Oh,
and that the previous occupants had tried for, however many years to have it closed down, and it was still going strong. So that's one end of the spectrum. I've also had, friends of mine have had the house next door burned down. But noise is the most common. Noisy neighbors is the most common complaint. But I've maybe listened to thousands of stories. I have had a noisy neighbor myself. I had he's moved now, but I had a guy next door who moved into, I live in a terraced house. I've got neighbors on either side of the walls. And he was doing a renovation, and he was doing it himself. He didn't have any money, so he didn't pay anyone to help him. He was an amateur who did it all himself. And he would work till 1 a.m, 2 a.m, drilling, cutting tiles. All the power tools were out. He didn't want to have his rubbish removed professionally, so he would just light a bonfire every so often to burn all of the rubbish that he brought out of his house. So he was awful, and I always knew it would make for a fantastic drama, particularly because my own reaction was so intense. I felt really emotional about it. And it just made me realize that we really overreact when our home life is threatened.
Well, it's where we feel most at peace, and it's where we want to just be ourselves, and we feel attacked personally.
That's right.
It really is just...
That's right. We're right to feel entitled to feel safe and sheltered and, tranquil in our homes. And so when you have it threatened on any level, the reaction is instant and it's much more violent than I think if you had a conflict at work, in the workplace, or, if something happened and you were having an argument in the park or the supermarket or the school. I think you would respond very differently, but people do seem to be subject to very violent emotions when they feel threatened in their home. It's a really natural human thing. And I think we also love reading about those stories because they're so unsettling, because it feels like it could happen to anyone.
Right, you can definitely identify, because not everyone has another home to leave to.
Or could even go on vacation. Like sometimes, when you're buying a house, that's your vacation for the next 5 years is your,
of course, yes,
your evenings
absolutely.
in your
and the characters,
house.
Ant and Em. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think if something goes wrong at work or something goes wrong in a friendship, it's relatively a smooth process to remove yourself from that. But it's not a smooth process to move house. It's prohibitively expensive. You might have kids in the local school. I mean, it's a much more complicated situation to extract yourself from. And as you say, you've probably saved all your money to buy the house in the first place or to pay the rent. You can't just get in your car and go on holiday. And that's why it's so tragic for Ant and Em Kendall in the book. They live right next door to the bad neighbors,
and they have a baby.
It's their first home.
Yeah.
They've got a baby, and lots of people can identify with that feeling. Lots of us buy our first home when we start a family. And, your life is full of optimism and dreams and, plans for raising your family the way you'd like to raise them. And to be within a couple of months to be faced with these neighbors from hell who actually are damaging your child's health. I mean, it's a really horrific situation. So I knew I wanted that to be at the center of the story. Because I just think it's the worst thing that can happen to any young couple, really.
Could I just ask a really quick question before we wrap up? Are your two last books, do they cross over in any way? I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but I couldn't help but notice that, what's his name? Bram had been involved or spoken to somebody named Jody in the past, and in my mind, is that just a name you liked, or is that the same Jody that was living with Darren?
Oh, no, definitely not the same Jody. I can't remember who Jody is.
It was just a one-off sentence,
house.
But having read two books back to back, it's just kind of something that came up. I was I wonder.
Let's say that's deliberate.
Especially, especially since just everything kind of weaves together so well in both of the books, and threads you think don't have anything to do with anything else kind of come back up. So it was that's pure coincidence, and that shows you that is one of my. Whenever people say, "What's your weakness as a writer?" I can say straight away, I find names really hard. I find it really hard to think of new names, and I have a rule where they must match the generation. So I wouldn't have a 55-year-old called Rocco, for instance, or Georgia. They would have the plain names of their own era, and so it does, particularly with male names. Actually, it really limits the pool. So no, that's a coincidence. But the neighborhoods are really similar. I found it interesting that you had a Finn who was kind of in his. How old was Finn, Ralph's brother? Would you say?
Finn. Oh yes, he is. He's in his 40s. A bit too modern.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of children are named Finn, as now in the U.S., it's become more of a popular name. So
it's a lovely name.
It is a wonderful name.
I think Finn began as something else. I think he began as someone else, and then I discovered an overlap.
Yes.
So yes, you're right. It does have more of a even here as well. Finn is more of a modern sounding name. Ralph is about right. It is hard. It is really, really hard without running out of names.
Well, we both want to thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. And congratulations on winning
you're very welcome.
British Book Awards.
Thank you. Yes, that was amazing. It was really a big surprise. I didn't expect to win that, and it was just a thoroughly enjoyable evening with many glasses of champagne drunk.
Well, thanks again. And once again, this is Jessica and
Donna.
And
Louise.
And
sorry, was that where I was supposed to type up?
No, you're good. You're perfect. And thanks again. And we're going to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Have a nice day.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Lovely to chat.
You too. Take care.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.